Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third season of Literature Berks. My name is Amanda Hornberger. I am the program director at the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks. And on behalf of our entire committee, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this program. Literature Berks is a community-wide celebration of books and authors presented by the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks in partnership with the Exeter Community Library and the Jewish Book Council. I'm thrilled to kick off these series of Violins of Hope events with Jay Grymes. He is an internationally respected musicologist, a critically acclaimed author, and a dynamic speaker who's addressed audiences at significant public venues such as the Well Recital Hall at Carnegie and the American Israel Public Affairs Committee and the historic 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Dr. Grymes has been featured in interviews by the New York Times, ABC News, and CNN, and has written essays for the Huffington Post and the Israeli music magazine Opus. He is the author of Violins of Hope, Instruments of Hope and Liberation in Mankind's Darkest Hour, published in 2014. The book, which composer John Williams described as one of the most moving chronicles in the history of Western music, presents a new way of understanding the Holocaust, and it won a National Jewish Book Award. He is a professor of musicology at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and I'm thrilled to welcome him back to Reading virtually through Literature Berks. How are you doing, Jay?
Great, thank you, Amanda, for such a warm and lovely introduction. It's great to be back, if only virtually, and looking forward to be back in person in almost exactly a month, I think.
Yeah, so I'm going to put it in the chat for details for everybody, but Jay will be here at Albright College for our annual Leo Camp lecture. It's Thursday, November 11th, 7:30 in the chapel, and he'll be joined by Afshi Weinstein, who's the curator of the Violins of Hope exhibit, and Todd Bornstein, who's going to be our violinist for the program. So Jay, can you just tell us, I know a lot of folks have read the book, but maybe there's some new folks here who haven't read anything about it. How did you come about this project? How did you find it?
Great question. It's one I get awful a lot because everybody always wants to know how a person who's not Jewish and who can't play a lick of violin, how do I come to write this book about this collection of instruments that were owned and played by Jewish musicians before and during the Holocaust? And the answer to that question is that the university where I teach, University of North Carolina at Charlotte, we had the honor of bringing 18 of the violins to our town in 2012. And that was the first time they'd been anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. So, and leading up to Violins of Hope, Charlotte, just like what's happening as we speak with Violins of Hope, Reading, Pennsylvania, it wasn't just something that came out of nothing. It was years of building the partnerships and creating the programming. And I wasn't a member of the team that was working to bring the Violins of Hope to Charlotte, but as a member of the faculty, they would come in every few months and they talk about the project and its importance and what they're working on. And so as a musician, as a music historian, I was really inspired by these stories. So in 2011, a year before the violins came to Charlotte, I took a trip out to Israel, my first trip to Israel, and spent a little over a week in Tel Aviv with Amnon Weinstein, the patriarch of this project and Avshalom's father, and learned his stories and saw the violins for myself and learned through him the stories of the violins. And it was during that trip that I became inspired to write the book about the Violins of Hope. So another year later, another trip out to Israel and interviewing the survivors who lived because of the violin. I never had a chance to meet with them. They had passed on before I began this project, but meeting with their children or grandchildren and learning those stories through them.
That's great. I can't believe it's been that long, like a decade. That's just so amazing. So what did your research look like? You talked about your trip to Tel Aviv. Did you have Holocaust knowledge really before this project, or how did you kind of go about researching it, especially if the survivors were no longer alive?
Right. Great question again. So I frankly didn't have a whole lot of knowledge about the Holocaust, growing up not in the Jewish community and just, traditional public school education, learning, shockingly little about it. And the little I did know about the Holocaust tended to be sort of monolithic. You learn a little bit about Hitler, Nazis, and Auschwitz, and then you move on sort of to the next chapter, I guess. And so I think when I was researching these stories, what struck me quite dramatically was the diversity of experiences. And so I'll circle back to the second part of your question about writing these stories. But as I was assembling the 6 major chapters of Violins of Hope, they're all very different from each other. And that was something for me, the first three sort of, is Nazi Germany, like, getting out. Those who went on to establish the Palestine Orchestra were able to get out. Then Erich Weininger, who barely got out and then was imprisoned as an illegal alien. And then those who were trapped behind after they closed the borders and were sent to concentration camps. And then the second half of the book, spending time in Romania and Norway and Ukraine, and such different stories. And I think for me, that's the real lesson that I learned was, and it's a regular reminder that the Holocaust is not a single story of 6 million deaths, it's 6 million different stories, and many of which we'll never know. But some of them we can get to know through the Violins of Hope. And a handful of those I was honored to be able to research and write about in my book, Violins of Hope. The stories came to me first through Amnon, and then I traced, work backwards from his sources in sort of various states. And that was actually kind of exciting and challenging to me as a historian. It seemed like every single chapter I had to come up with a different methodology for how I was going to build this chapter. And so the chapter on Erich Weininger, chapter 2, that was something, he, like many survivors, really didn't like to talk about his experiences during the Holocaust. And so his son inherited the violin that he played in Dachau and Buchenwald, and then in this prisoner camp on the island of Mauritius, and maybe 5 bullet points about the broad outline of where his father had been during the Holocaust. And as is true all the time in oral histories, over time the son sort of, some of the facts got a little fudged. He had the 2 camps his father was in reverse order. Nothing major, just what you'd expect. The German records are actually pretty methodical about that, so it was easy to untangle that. But that was a story, like I said, I had maybe 5 bullet points, but then once I figured out where Erich was at different times, I could go to memoirs of other survivors who are at the same place at the same time, or biographies of that figure, and sort of build this whole world around Erich, even though I knew where he was and what was going on, so was able to kind of follow him around that way. The other end of the coin is the final large chapter, that of young Motula. And he was basically adopted by Uncle Misha, this partisan commander. And of the 6, of course, figures I write about in the main chapters, Motula is the only one who doesn't survive. Everybody else is able to survive because of their abilities to make music. He dies in combat. And after he died, and after the Holocaust, Uncle Misha wrote a biography of him, of all the stories, because Uncle Misha had basically sort of adopted young Motula, and Uncle Misha's biological son was very much like a brother to Motula. And so he had this whole biography of him in Yiddish. But that was a whole narrative that I already had at my disposal. And it was my job as a historian to kind of go back and flesh out the historical details and do as much fact checking as I could. But those are the other opposite ends of the spectrum of having lots of stuff and just needing to bolster it up, and then having almost nothing and having to build everything, kind of put it together like a Lego set.
That sounds fascinating and so interesting too, because I'm sure as you discovered some pieces, the story developed further and further, which is always fun, I feel like, for historians and writers to go through an archive and just find something, which is so exciting. So I think absolutely. A lot of folks know the Violins will be here in Reading, November 1st to the 14th. We're going to have 3 exhibit locations: the Goggle Works Center for the Arts, Alvernian University, and Kutztown University. So I want to talk about, if we can, some of the violins that we know are coming to Reading and that you actually highlight in your book. So what can you tell us about Erich Weininger, and which camps did he play in?
Right, so that's Erich Weininger. He was an amateur butcher, a professional butcher, amateur violinist. And he early on was taken to Dachau. This was at the period when the Nazis had not quite come up with a final solution. Their goal at that point was to strip Jews of their civil rights and take them to these camps and humiliate them and beat them and hope they left of their own accord. So he was taken to Dachau and was brutally beaten and forced into slave labor and all kinds of horrendous conditions. But on Sundays, the camp guards would sort of look the other way and be rather lax with monitoring the prisoners. And so Erich Weininger and several other musicians formed a clandestine orchestra. and they would play in this building. At the time, it was an unfinished latrine building, and it only had room for a handful of musicians and a handful of prisoners. And so they would cycle the prisoners through in, each would get just a few moments of time, but they're in the darkness and disparity of Dachau just for a few moments. They were listening to music and they were transported back to better times. He was released from Dachau, then he was sent to Buchenwald and released, and really became among the very last Jews to be able to leave Europe before the borders were closed. But it certainly wasn't an easy trip. They had to fund their own way, and they ended up on this boat that's going through the Mediterranean Sea, and it runs out of fuel. And so they start actually chopping up the boat and burning that. There's pictures of that. There's someone in Yad Vashem, I believe, that someone has of this, and you can see this basically skeleton of a ship. And the
Wow.
British mandate discovered it just sort of listing along, and they towed it to Cyprus. And then they decided they didn't know what to do with these Jewish immigrants. The British mandate had decided that they were not going to allow any more Jewish immigrants to Palestine. They were trying to appease the Arab population there. And so they had these sort of stateless, later we'd call them displaced persons, but at the time they're just refugees. And so what they decided to do was tow the boat to Palestine, and as soon as it reached Palestinian waters, they arrested everybody on the boat as illegal aliens, and they put them in a camp first at Lit. And at that time, it's sort of this sort of Keystone Cops moment where the British guards decide they want to take Erich Weininger's violin, and they'd come into the courtyard, the fenced off courtyard where he was, and he'd throw the violin over the fence to his fellow prisoners on the other side. And then the guards would go into that other court and they would throw it back. So it's sort of really funny moment there. And they ended up deciding they were going to send these prisoners to the island of Mauritius on the other side of Africa, and put them in an old prison. And so Erich and others spent 3 or 4 years in this prison, but again, he still had this violin with him, and he and some fellow musicians did what they'd done at every other stop along this amazing odyssey, is they made music for their own entertainment as well as to lift the spirits of their fellow prisoners. So that violin went through that amazing odyssey and then found its way through Erich's son to the Violins of Hope project. Will be coming to Reading in just
a
2
couple
short weeks.
Yeah,
two
so
short
you
weeks.
can see Erich violin at the Goggle Works. It'll be on display there. One of the instruments that's also coming to Reading was played by an unnamed musician from Auschwitz. Can you talk a little bit about the orchestra that was in Auschwitz and what conditions were like for those musicians?
Right, absolutely. That's talking about orchestras in concentration camps is always something that's surprising to a lot of people, because this ensemble we associate with such great beauty would exist in a place we associate with such great despair. And the truth is that there were orchestras throughout the Nazi camp system. Almost every camp had some sort of ensemble, including the complex we refer to collectively as Auschwitz. The Auschwitz main camp had a symphony orchestra of 80 to 100 musicians, as many as 120 musicians in its orchestra. The men's camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau had its own orchestra. The women's camp had its own ensemble. And regardless of where they were, the orchestra's main function was to play at the camp gates every morning as their fellow prisoners were being marched out to work detail in regular rows of 5 to instill what the Germans referred to as marching discipline, essentially helping the prisoners stay in step as they marched out in regular rows of 5, which made it easy for the Nazis to count the prisoners on their way out: 5, 10, 15, 20. And so the prisoners would play these small German marches. They were prisoners who were conscripted into the orchestra because of their ability to make music. And they would also be sent to work detail, but they would be the last ones out and then the first ones back to set the orchestra back up to start playing again as their fellow prisoners came back. And some of them actually, because of their privileged positions in the orchestra, enjoyed certain status type things. They had slightly warmer uniforms. They were allowed to work inside. Some were assigned to the kitchen. So you're working inside in the Polish winter, as well as you might be able to grab an extra bite a food or two when no one's looking. Some stayed behind to repair the instruments or arrange new music. The camp administration was remarkably fixated on the repertoire of the orchestra. They always wanted new tunes, so they would come to the musicians and sort of hum these German marches, and the musicians would transcribe them and then arrange them, and they had to find really clever ways of arranging them because they never quite knew who was going to be in the orchestra the next day, because any of them could have been selected and sent to their deaths. And while membership in the orchestra by no means guaranteed one's survival, the members in the orchestra who were placed in there because they're able to make music did survive in larger numbers than the general population. Those slight privileges gave them just small advantages they needed to live one more day, and then one more day, and then one more day, until ultimately they outlived the Nazi regime. The legacy of these orchestras is difficult. The survivors who didn't play in the orchestra had mixed feelings. You know, the music itself was used to deceive the Jews. Sometimes the orchestras would play not just at the camp gates for the prisoners. Sometimes they play while other prisoners were being marched to their deaths. Sometimes they play at the train stop, that famous train stop at Auschwitz, as a way to deceive the Jews who are arriving on the train. So of course now for us it's a fait accompli, right? What was happening. But to those Jews who were pushed into these cattle cars with, you know, you can carry your 50 kilograms of luggage, and all they knew is they just needed to stay alive a little longer. They were on these cattle car voyages for 2-3 days with no food, no water, no sanitation, very little air. And then the doors are thrown open and they see in front of them a beautifully manicured lawn, and there's an orchestra playing. And many survivors recall thinking to each other and saying to each other, you know, okay, so how bad could this place be? Maybe we finally arrived somewhere nice for a change. But it was really just a deception to keep them calm while they lined up for the selection, you know, you to the right, you to the left, those who were able to work sent into the camp, and the sick, the elderly, the young, the pregnant, those who were deemed unfit for work sent immediately to their deaths while this orchestra played. And then there's those who despised the orchestra because of the schmaltzy music it played. Primo Levi writes in Survivor of Auschwitz of being in the infirmary in Auschwitz III and hearing the music of the orchestra sort of wafting through the air, the bass drum and the cymbals. And he said to himself, we all think this music is infernal. What an insult to us to be in this place and hear this schmaltzy, peppy German marches all the time. Other survivors appreciated the fact that when they were dragging their exhausted bodies back to the camp at the end of the day, they really had one role there, and it was to look healthy and to survive a selection. And so having this peppy music gave them that pep in their step that they needed to continue on and to move forward. Some of the musicians themselves went on to become professional musicians. Others never wanted to play again. You know, music is something that is very closely tied to our memory. It's just, you know, just the way the brain works. And probably all of us have had the experience where, you know, we might turn on the radio and hear a song we hadn't heard in decades, and it just takes us right back to getting our heart broken or a happy moment or something. The music is indelibly linked to those memories. And so I've heard from survivors who weren't in the orchestra who never really could listen to music again, just because of the music. Every time they heard any kind of melody, it brought them back to being in a camp. But for the musicians, there's that musical memory and also the tactile memory of, you know, bringing the violin to the body again to play. And every time they brought that violin back up, it transported them back to being in Auschwitz, and maybe even remembering what it was like to play while they watched fellow prisoners, perhaps including their own loved ones, being marched to their deaths, and not being able to warn them, not being able to help them, not be able to do anything but play silly, happy music. And so they simply never wanted to play again. So one survivor, yeah, unfortunately, yeah, we've lost his name. He sold his violin right after the Holocaust to an aid worker named Abraham Davidovich, who just bought the instrument in the hopes that his sons would learn to play it. And so unfortunately, it didn't occur to him to write down the man's name. But he did give the violin to his sons and pass down the story behind the violin. And the sons never really took to the violin. And so as they were well into adulthood, they started talking about, you know, what should we do with this violin? It's, you know, in the back of a closet. It was in Auschwitz. So, you know, you're not going to put it on eBay. What are you going to do? They considered donating it to Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Authority. And the Yad Vashem, as the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum here in the States, has sort of warehouses full of stuff, right? So it's not really a guarantee that you're going to give something to Yad Vashem. It's going to be on display where folks can see it. So they ended up donating it to the Violins of Hope project because they were really inspired by the idea that this violin will not only be put on display, but will actually be played. And so through the exhibits and through the playing itself, as one of Abraham Davidovich's sons told me, what he said was, I hope that this violin will go on playing after me and for many generations. And so that's Violin's story and how it worked its way to the Violins of Hope project. And it too will be in Reading in what?
2 weeks.
20 days.
Yeah, super close. 2 weeks from Sunday. I love that you touched on so many great points there, like the complexity, not only for the musicians, but for the other prisoners and the deception. I think people are just always so surprised when they hear that there was music in the camps. The violin that Jay just mentioned with that history will be at Kutztown University on display. There's also another violin from Auschwitz. Both of them will be played live in a concert November 13th with Reading Symphony Orchestra. I put a link in the chat if you're interested in buying tickets. There's tickets still available. If people have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat. I have a few more that I want to go through. I know there's one other book, there's one other violin that you talk about in your book that I know is definitely coming to Reading, and that's Weininger's, which was described by him as his friend. What can you tell us about him and his story?
Right, so Fievel was an amateur violinist who was sent on a death march with his family through the rain and the snow, the winter of Transnistria, October 1941. You know, another situation where his family was told, the whole town, all the Jews must report to the train station by noon or you'll be shot on the spot. So they had no idea where they were going or what was happening. All they knew is if they wanted to live past noon, they had to comply. And so they were put on the train, taken a while, and then taken off the train and sent on this death march. And along the way, Fievel watched as his fellow prisoners died from exhaustion, from being beaten, from starvation, from the elements. His uncle died, his mother died, and he had with him his daughter, Helen, who was 18 months old at the time. And her mother was too weak now to produce milk. And so young Helen was growing increasingly emaciated herself until she lost the strength to even cry. And they ended up in the ghetto of Shagorod in Transnistria, this territory that Romania had recently re-annexed and had basically decided to treat as an ethnic dumping ground. They're going to send all their Jewish population there, those who survived the death march at least, with no food, water, or way to provide for themselves, and just get them out of sight and out of mind. And in the ghetto, Fievel managed to get his hands on actually a rather expensive violin and started playing the violin at parties for Romanian officers and Ukrainian farmers. At one point, that violin was confiscated, and there was a Ukrainian farmer who insisted that Fievel play for his daughter's wedding. So the Ukrainian farmer helped Fievel buy a rather inexpensive amateur violin, but it was good enough for Fievel to play on. And the deal was he would play at these Romanian parties, which were multi-day affairs that would go on 2 or 3 days nonstop. He'd play the entire time. Apparently a pretty good musician because he didn't know the Ukrainian folk songs that they sometimes requested, but that old joke, hum a few bars and maybe I can fake it. He would pick up the tunes very quickly and play them for them. The agreement was, though, when that 2 or 3 day party was over, if there's any leftover firewood or water or food, he could bring that home to his family. And so through playing the violin, Fievel was able to not only stay alive himself, but save the lives of 16 family members and friends, including young Helen. After the Holocaust, Fievel and his family made Aliyah. They immigrated to Palestine at the time, then Israel, and he brought with him this instrument, as Amanda said, that he simply called friend. And so as Helen was growing up, he would regularly take out his friend and play the violin for her and tell her the stories about this friend that had saved his life and her mother's life. And it was really even more than a friend, really a member of the family. And as Fievel grew older and older, he started to develop arthritis. It became difficult for him to play until the point where he was about to turn 90 and he hadn't played his friend for several years. And Helen went and visited him. He was in a home at that time and said, 90 is a pretty big birthday, Dad. Let's do something really special. What would you like more than anything else in the world? And he looked at her and he said, you know what, Helen, what I really want is to be able to play my friend again. I know he's not in good shape and I haven't played him for a long time and he's not in good repair. Maybe you can find somebody who can fix him, at least so I can play him, if only one more time. And so Helen said, yes, of course, that makes perfect sense. So she took friend. Helen's not a musician. She had a distinguished career in the IDF, but if you ask around in Israel, I have a violin that needs to be fixed. Where should I take this? It's the Weinstein workshop is always the place to go. So she took it to the Weinstein workshop. She didn't tell them the story. She just said, oh, this is my father's violin. I'd like to get it repaired. Okay, just leave it there on the counter. I'll take a look at it and then I'll give you a call once I look at it carefully. So Amnon called her that night and said, Helen, I have to be honest with you. This was not a good instrument was made. It really hasn't been well maintained. It's really going to take a lot of work. We're going to have to take the instrument apart and work on the insides. And basically this instrument is totaled. The amount it'll take to repair it is worth far more than the instrument's intrinsic value. And you'd frankly be better off just buying a brand new violin. And so Helen goes back to Fievel and she said, all right, change your plans, Dad. I'm going to buy you a brand new violin for your birthday. And Fievel just started crying. And he said, no, you don't understand. It's not just about playing the violin again. It's about playing my violin again, my friend. Surely there's something you can do. And Helen immediately understood. She went back to Amnon. She told him now the story, and he immediately understood. Whole new ball game. I'm going to fix this up for you, better than new, no charge. This is such a special instrument and such a special story. And I never met Fievel. He passed away before I began my work on the Violins of Hope project. But Helen had the foresight to bring her camera with her on Fievel's birthday when he was reunited with his friend. And I don't think I ever fully understood the expression grinning from ear to ear until I saw this picture of this 9-year-old man just absolutely beaming with joy at being reunited with his friend. And he was able to play a little bit, but not too much. But nevertheless, from that day until the day he died, at least once a day, he would open up the case, take out his friend, and cradle it in his arms and shed these tears of gratitude for this friend that had saved him and his family during the Holocaust.
That's such an amazing story. It's just like I'm almost ready to cry. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's great. And after he passed away, then Helen sort of returned the favor and brought the violin back to Amnon for the Violins of Hope project, so that violin can not only go on display but be performed all over the world.
Yeah, so that violin will be at the Goggle Works on display, and then it will be pulled out for the Reading Symphony Orchestra's concert, so you can hear that amazing, amazing story. Again, if you have questions, feel free to add them to the chat. I just want to read Deborah's message. She says, the book is an incredible gift to the family members of those whose stories are related in its pages, and a gift to those of us who seek to continuously understand this dark, dark chapter of our world history. I found it illuminating and inspiring page after page. As a musician, but not a string player, or even an instrumentalist, I was continuously amazed to think that anyone or anything could survive the atrocities we know occurred. And I cannot wait to see and hear some of the violins next month here in Reading. Thank you, Jay, for your exceptional writing. Shalom. Thank you for
Deborah.
that message.
That's very kind. Thank you for that.
So like I mentioned, the violins will be here November 1st to the 14th. They'll be on display at the Goggle Works Center for the Art on the second floor gallery, the Miller Gallery at Alvernia University, and the New Media Gallery at Kutztown University. There are tons of great events and things happening all throughout that time. There's lots of different concerts and opportunities. We are taking the violins into 15 of the 18 school districts here in Berks County, and we're just thrilled about that. I just put another link back in the chat. If you visit our website, violinsofhopepa.org, you'll find out all kinds of information about events and programs happening during this time. Jay, do you get to travel with the Violins of Hope exhibit? You mentioned that the very first exhibit was in Charlotte, but now, as we know, it's kind of blown up. It's going everywhere. So have you had the opportunity to travel a lot with the exhibit?
Yeah, absolutely. That's been a real joy for me to go out with the violins. pretty much almost anywhere the violins go, I'll appear at some point or another. Sometimes by myself, sometimes as we'll have in Reading on November, is it 11th? Is it Kristallnacht?
It's
Uh,
November 11th, 2 days after
yeah,
Kristallnacht. Yeah.
right. And sometimes I'll appear with Avshalom Feinstein, who is Amnon's son, who has really taken over the project and does all of the organizing work now. So I think we're going to have me and Avshi, and you mentioned Amanda, a violinist.
Yeah, so Todd Bornstein, whose parents are involved in Federation here locally, he will be our musician that night. And yeah, I love it. It'll be a really fun event.
I'm really looking forward to it.
That's super exciting. So can you share, I know you shared a couple stories already, but do you have a favorite violin story or memory from your work with the project?
Well, it's sort of like, asking what your favorite child is. The chapters are all so different, I think, and difficult in their own ways, and dealing with such tragic and immense subject matter. I think certainly the hardest to write emotionally was the chapter on Weininger. We will never know what it was like to walk in those shoes, but at a human level, we can learn and we can empathize. And so with Fievel, there's a lot going on, because I was thinking a new father myself, of being in a position where I might be unable to protect my family, and maybe through music being able to protect my family. But it was especially difficult because as I was writing about Helen, his daughter Helen, who was 18 months old at the time when they were on the death march, I couldn't help but think about my own daughter, also named Helen, who was the exact same age when I was working on this chapter. So that was one of those, very often in the writing process, there's just sometimes I just had to stop. I'd sort of reached my emotional capacity and just couldn't deal with the darkness anymore, and had to walk away. But then that was one where I had to stop periodically, because it was really difficult emotionally to write.
Yeah, for sure. I know I find myself sometimes, getting caught up in all the details and then having to go back and then realize, these were people. And like you mentioned earlier, these are so many individual stories. 6 million can be really overwhelming, but when you really break it down to individual stories. And what I love is there's so many different stories. One of my favorites, which is a violin we're going to be taking into the schools, is the Hecht violin, which was owned by a German family. And then they were left Germany and went to Amsterdam, and they gave it to a neighbor, and the neighbor kept the violin in an attic for decades, and the family never returned, and they were killed in various camps throughout Europe. And that they, the neighborly love of somebody taking care of something for so long, and then just feeling like it had to go back to the Jewish community. And now it's being played and it's going to schools. I just feel like there's so many amazing stories throughout the collection, and I just love getting to learn and hear these stories and share. I think it helps, like you said, personalize and also remember those individuals. So now it's like I know 4 more victims' names that kind of pull at my heartstrings a little bit. So I feel like that's always a great way to educate people that it's not just 6 million. If you can remember one name, that's always a really, really important thing.
Absolutely. We throw around these numbers of 11 million deaths, 6 million Jewish deaths. It's just such a large number. The brain can't even comprehend the enormity of a tragedy of that nature. And so I think that is why it's important for us to look at the lives of individuals. And I think why the writings of Primo Levi or Elie Wiesel or Anne Frank, I think that's why those have been so important to us and have resonated with us, because they help to humanize what is otherwise an unimaginable tragedy. And I hope that's what we're also able to do through the Violins of Hope project, as you say, is provide names and stories that would otherwise never be known, sort of with the gratitude for learning those stories, but also the sorrow for the much larger number of names and stories we'll never know.
Absolutely. You kind of tied right into my next question. That was probably like the perfect answer. But Violins of Hope, it's coming to Reading. It's only here for 14 days. What tips, tricks would you recommend to people to kind of get the most out of their experience?
Well, I'd say definitely go see the exhibit. And I think, Amanda, sometimes there will be one or two that are missing as they're taking out.
Yeah, but they're going to be
certain-
replaced. So we have
Yeah.
replacement. So that'll be, yeah.
That's actually really interesting. When we brought them to Charlotte, that was the first time. So we were learning, building an airplane while we were flying it. And the violins would be, individual ones would be taken out of the display and go to this school or something. And the people who were in charge of the display were really sort of worried that, people can be disappointed that they come and we say there's 18, there's only 15 today. But it turns out that the people were really tickled by just little placards that would say, "So sorry, this violin's not here. It's being played at this school today." And they actually liked that because it was a reminder that it's more that the violins make beautiful display pieces, but it's more than just being on display, that they come alive again. And that's really what's at the heart of the Violins of Hope project. And it's something special of a really unique confluence of like the perfect people with the perfect project. Because Amnon, I write about him in Violins of Hope, losing 400 family members in the Holocaust, and his growing up in post-Holocaust Israel in this family where it was just his immediate family. They didn't have any extended family, no uncles, no aunts, no grandparents, no cousins, but in a house where the parents would never talk about. Their grief and their guilt was so strong, they refused to speak of it, but that guilt permeated every aspect of Amnon's life growing up as in that household. And then, his father was a violin salesman and violin repairman, so learning that craft from his father. And then ultimately, when he is teaching that same craft using the same tools in the same workshop to his son Avshalom, who might be the first, to the best of our knowledge at least, is the first third generation Jewish luthier in history. Now he's ready to go back. How could he not be thinking of his father as he's standing where his father stood, and here is his son standing where he once stood, same techniques, same tools, same workshop. Starts thinking about the role that music, specifically violin, played during the Holocaust. So he has, it's part of who he is, but also he's probably one of a handful of people in the entire world who has the ability to pull off the type of restoration work that is required. Some of these violins, they were never great instruments. They've been severely neglected. They're damaged. It can take a year and a half or more to restore these instruments. But he and Avshalom have the techniques, and not just the techniques, sometimes the actual materials that Amnon inherited from his father. His father brought a lot of wood and other materials from Eastern Europe with him to Palestine. And so when Amnon is looking at this violin, it's early 20th century Eastern European make. He actually has the matching wood in his workshop. So he has the materials, the technical know-how, and the heart to really bring this thing together. So you see them in an exhibit. Many of the violins are klezmer instruments that have stars of David inlaid in the wood. This is something that was fairly typical in the early 20th century, and violin makers would have various different designs that they would put in the violins. And it was not unusual for klezmer musicians to specifically request the six-sided star, which of course to them was a Star of David. And with the hopes that, if their violin looked a little flashier and a little more Jewish, maybe that's the rabbi would recommend them for the wedding, and they get an extra tip or two. And so you'll see these violins that were klezmer instruments with these very beautiful stars of David, but then you have to hear them played. It's really, the fact that these voices and spirits are living on is really something quite astounding. And of course, with the Reading Symphony, you have one of the great violin virtuosos of the 20th century. And of course, if it's a great violin virtuoso, it's inherently an Israeli. Right, yeah. So Pinchas Zuckerman playing with the Reading Philharmonic, and really hearing these instruments. So he'll be playing, and also the musicians, some of the musicians in the orchestra were playing on.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, no, it's very powerful. It's a very almost like a spiritual experience. I would you know, when you hear them being played and you think of the stories and, you know, all the things that they've been through. I'm going to open it up. If anyone has a question, you're welcome to unmute, raise your hand. I can unmute you. Put your question in the chat box. We'll keep talking for a few more minutes with Jay. I don't see anything coming through at the moment. I guess my last question that I have is, what lessons would you hope that readers would gain through your book?
I think the big picture of what we've sort of been hitting on repeatedly just in tonight's discussion, the reminder that the Holocaust is not a single story of 6 million deaths, it's 6 million different stories, but also of these diversity of experiences of, you know, even if you're in the same camp at the same time, you're probably having a very different experience from those around you. And just all these lessons and these stories are all so inspiring in their own way. And so again, it was a real honor, really the honor of a lifetime to be able to tell 6 of those stories in the book Violins of Hope. But it continues to be, for me, a tremendous joy to visit with various communities, either digitally via Zoom, as you know, has been happening obviously a lot over the past 20 months, but also to visit these communities and get to know the folks. So I'm really excited. I was in Reading, what was this, Amanda, 2015?
2015, I think you were here, yeah.
Yeah, the book came out in 2014, so yeah, right after that, that was a real joy, and I'm really looking forward to coming back.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you come back. Jay will be in person November 11th at Albright College, 7:30 in their chapel. We will have books available for purchase, and Jay will be signing them that evening. If you would like a book prior to that, you're welcome to stop by the JCC, send us an email. I will make sure that you get a copy. And I just want to, again, remind you to visit violinsofhopepa.org. That's where you'll find all of our events. Visit Ticketmaster to get tickets to the Reading Symphony Orchestra concert. There's also a Friends of Chamber Music concert. There's another smaller concert held at Emmanuel UCC. So there's a lot of great events happening. We hope to see you. I encourage you to visit all 3 of our exhibit locations, the Goggle Works, Center for the Arts, Alvernia University, and Kutztown University. There are different violins at each place. They're not rotating between the 3. So to get the full scope, I highly encourage you to visit all 3. And I'm really honored that we'll be able to highlight some of our local survivors from Reading at each of the exhibits. So there's 3 unique stories being told all throughout Berks. And I think that that'll really hopefully help make, again, that human connection, that personal touch to this history. Jay, thank you so much for joining us. I can't wait to see you in just a few short weeks. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great night.
Thanks, Amanda. Looking forward to seeing you again in
Take
person.
care.
Thanks.